Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today I am looking at Season 1, Episode 10, Culture Shock and F.U.N, both of which aired on September 18th, 1999. But before I get started on looking into these episodes and their legacies and how I feel about them, my question of the week this week for you is, how do you watch SpongeComs? Do you watch it on a monitor? Do you watch it on your phone? Do you just turn your phone off and put it in your pocket and listen to me while you're out? Let me know exactly how you watch this, and I might further change SpongeComs to accommodate that. But for now, let's get into the episodes. Culture Shock was written by Paul Tibbett, Mark O'Hare, and Mr. Lawrence, all of which are mainstays at this point. Mark O'Hare, I think, was a mostly pre-movie person. I think right after the movie, he went on to work on Camp Lazlo, but yeah, this is a very fun episode to talk about. But it does start with a slow day at the Krusty Krab, and by season 7 and 8, you're going to get very, very tired of slow day at the Krusty Krab episode starters. Like when I was doing the reviews, these were just agonizing to see start every single episode. Like a majority of season 8 episodes start with this sort of, why isn't anyone coming? What can we do to boost business? Especially an episode that is basically a knockoff of this, that plays the thing from season 7. But you know what Culture Shock has over the later versions of the slow day start? It has atmosphere. It has, like, Western music playing in the background. It has a lot of jokes about how tired things are getting. It is very similar to Patty Hype in that regard, but Culture Shock admittedly had a teensy bit more atmosphere. I don't know why. Maybe it's the cell animation making the slowness work a teensy bit better. I can't really determine it. But at least we've also got some energy to pick the episode back up here, with SpongeBob giving the guy his change. That's the only reason he came in. At least it's a lot better than a guy starving to death, and we see Mr. Krabs is safe for the first time, I think. It's at least the first time it's ever been focused on, and yes, again, by season 7 and 8, that is something that you see time and time again, to the point that it loses its meaning. But in season 1, it is fresh, it is exciting, for lack of a better word, exciting. And I do really like the idea of Squidward putting together a talent show for the Krusty Krab, and I think that this episode was very important to making people like Squidward more. It's not my favourite episode of season 1 by a long, long shot. However, I do see it as a very good Squidward episode because it gives him more of a quirk to the show. He does like theatre, he does like drama, he does like all these not old-timey things, but things that middle-aged people are into, like interpretive dance and freeform jazz. It does give him some flavour and make him less of, like, Mr. Wilson as an octopus. And I also do really like SpongeBob's contribution to this episode and wanting to do anything to be on stage, even engorge himself. But Squidward's like, nope, this is for the talented, and SpongeBob just doesn't seem so talented to Squidward because his ideas of productions are sort of gimmicky and childish. But they are fun types of gimmicky and childish. Like here, he puts on this Charlie Chaplin routine with a bubble hippo. I think that's a hippo. And he looks very off model during like the first tap dance bit there. But the rest of that is still very silly, very funny. I like it. This is one of these episodes where the SpongeBob and Squidward dynamic is great for the most part because you do really know what they're like. Talent is very broad, and this episode is going all out and showing that. And it is fun. Another fun thing about this episode is all the characters that get their second appearances on the show here. For SpongeBob's parents, it's technically their first in terms of like production order. I'm sure around this point, Nickelodeon was like, we've got to have SpongeBob's parents in here by some point. And this was written maybe written and or animated before Home Sweet Pineapple, so for the crew, this is their first appearance on the show. And like Home Sweet Pineapple, it doesn't set a very interesting precedent for them. I can only think of a few episodes where they're really characters. But again, SpongeBob engorging himself. This is some very nice animation here with, like, him using the underwater water to change its shape in all different ways. Don't know exactly if, like, human or sponge human, like, changing your body for entertainment was more popular in the 90s than it is now. I think we've sort of grown out of, oh, I'm just going to stuff my face until it turns purple or something. But you know, I like being purple. Oh, and speaking of which, Patrick is in this episode. He isn't very good. I think this is him coming up. His only joke is that he laughs at everything Squidward says, even the things that aren't funny, and it gets unfunny. Like, it's an alright routine if you don't mind season 1 Patrick. Like, I mind him a couple times. I think he's an overall good character. I'm not doing SpongeComs just to diss on early Patrick. But again, dumb comedy is very broad, and they just went all across the spectrum with Patrick in terms of what to do with him. Already I'm getting tired of this joke. And right after this, we get another second appearancer, Pearl, who puts on a little cheerleading routine. Cheerleading isn't really a part of Pearl's personality after this. I'm guessing because she's generally unpopular with other teenagers, especially at school and especially around her dad. So it doesn't make too much sense for her to be much of a cheerleading type because those are generally very popular girls in high school. But that it does kind of come up again in Goons on the Moon, I think. She was supposed to be the high school cheerleader in that, and her friend, already forgotten her name, was supposed to be the high school geek. And this is the second half of SpongeBob's contribution to this episode. Him just doing everything he can to be positive whilst cleaning up behind the stage. That is very silly and charming. Oh, and Gary's voice is a teensy bit different here. Maybe it's the poem, maybe it's the fact that they still didn't get the right meow out of Tom Kenny yet. But it is very different. And it seems to be the only part of the show that any of the audience likes. Oh, and Mr. Cleanser and Dr. Clean. I'm putting my finger on one of them being the best in town and the other being the best around. That causes a lot of confusion with those sorts of brands. Oh, and the second airing appearance of Plankton, he plays a vital role in this episode's sister episode. But this is another fun little bit with him causing a ruckus in the Krusty Krab with his production of being a magician and trying to steal the Krusty Krab through magician means. It isn't much, but I do like it. And it shows, like, more of the interaction between Plankton and Mr. Krabs. Very, very briefly, but it is still fun. But now the audience is in a bit of a sad state, so Squidward stops the show with a showstopper. And this is my favorite scene in the episode. This crisis point where Squidward tries to do his interpretive dance. Not only because it's funny and it's really well animated and fun to watch, but also because it serves as development for Squidward. Now he has a silly side to him, and that is so great to see finally materialize. Because it keeps him from being a Mr. Wilson type. As I said, he has an extra layer to him now. Like, he thinks that this is art, and it is to an extent, but it's not really something that a 40-year-old man would enjoy. And Squidward, being this sort of out of touch with 40-year-olds. 40-year-old does sort of have this idea that interpretive dance is hip and awesome. There was a episode recently called Mind the Gap, which is about Squidward trying to fit in with cool people. And yeah, it does sort of continue these trends, and I do like that. And finally, we've got the climax. SpongeBob saving the show by mopping up. And I think I wouldn't like this scene as much if it were in season 5, 6, 7, or 8, because SpongeBob might not have deserved to have all the applause, in part because he was so annoying and Squidward would have more justifiably deserved it for all the trouble he went through. But in season 1, in this episode specifically, it makes all the difference. It's just showing how SpongeBob really needed some recognition for just being a happy camper all around, and Squidward needed his bubble burst. And this little routine right here is just classic of Squidward testing just how much the audience likes SpongeBob. I'd really like to see those audience appreciation ratings. Like, if someone did like a health bar meme thing with that, that'd be very fun to see. But you know what? At least the Squidward talent show will continue on, and Mr. and Mrs. SquarePants get a few more lines, so it's a decent conclusion to a pretty decent episode. Not one of my favorites because I feel it's pretty thin plot-wise, but it's got a lot of great jokes. F.U.N was written by Sherm Cohen, Aaron Springer, and Peter Burns. We don't know much about Peter Burns because he left like 3 episodes after this, but Cohen and Springer are known to have more goofball ideas for like designs and personalities and story types. So it's no surprise that this is one of the sillier episodes of season 1, notwithstanding this intro, which keeps Plankton intimidating. This is the first time he's stealing from the Krusty Krab, and it's a massive deal to the customers because the Krusty Krab's on lockdown and all. And I do really like that. The color's changing. It's great. And also this shot here of him seemingly growing while getting the patty back to the chum bucket. Doesn't seem to be taking it to the chum bucket, actually. But besides that, this episode does kick off with very, very awesome SpongeBob antics. This is one of the first times he is really portrayed as awesome, because he goes on this great little adventure to nab the Plankton picked patty. It took me 3 seconds to think up. And we get some more city shots. I talked about in Home Holiday they don't go to the city much in season 1. But they do make a lot of good jokes about it in here, like SpongeBob using the baton, a police baton, as a propeller. That's funny. And then it gets a lot more wacky as he uses his hat as some sort of ride. This sort of stuff is why Aaron Springer was such a great writer for SpongeBob, because you could never predict exactly how silly his jokes could get. And I guess this little magic shop bit is another great scene because it sort of does foreshadow SpongeBob's worldview. He's got a cool moment here, but it's immediately followed up by him talking about this time he met a magician and saying he believes in magic and dreaming and the world being happy. And it shows this great contrast between him and Plankton. And I think that this is what the episode is about. The contrast between good and evil in the context of a silly little kid and a jaded business owner. And that does sort of make this episode stick out against other Plankton episodes, because there are a few times they really try to go this deep into Plankton's loneliness outside of Sponge Out of Water, which this episode shares a lot of similarities with structurally. But I'd say that this episode was the first did it better, you know? Of course, this little scene with them, the other Bikini Bottomites, really rubbing Plankton in Wasn't the best in the world, but something about that little pink donut thing. Don't know exactly the name of it, but I've always wanted one of those. Seriously, though. And the green sky, that's really cool. So I've basically got my feelings out of the way on what this story is saying, and if you're watching this alongside the episode, this is why I have the question of the week. It is sort of why... Gosh, I forgot what I was saying. I'm not feeling great at the moment, but either way, I do kind of like Plankton's more abstract beakers in the background. They didn't need to be like that, at all. It must have taken more effort to make them abstract than it would have to make them realistic. But I do kind of like that sort of detail in season 1, especially when they just really needed to show that they were a cartoon. And of course, Karen's got a teensy bit more personality, and she is a supercomputer, so she does give him, Plankton, the plan to manipulate SpongeBob and get the patty from him by pretending to be an acquaintance. And you can still kind of see Plankton's crack from his debut episode. I'm sure it's fully phased out by the end of season 1. It isn't the most efficient use of a character model. And I think that the jellyfishing is sort of another good aspect to this episode, because it is carefree, but it is sort of violent. That is what jellyfishing, the episode, was about. One of the things it tried to say was that jellyfishing, as in fishing for jellyfish, is really hard in SpongeBob's world due to the nature of jellyfish and how much they hurt. And having that be the springboard for SpongeBob and Plankton learning about how to have fun in their own way and launching into the fun song, that's just great. And the fun song is classic SpongeBob through and through. There is no better way of describing it. Pretty much everyone who grew up in the 2000s, and even today, mostly, know the lyrics to this song. It is that simple and catchy. It was basically the anthem for the first 3 seasons of the show, if you discount the title sequence theme song. But this little bit with Plankton is great, and although I personally prefer the Best Day Ever song, I'm going to be one of those nutcases that says that. The fun song is a classic through and through. It is fundamentally more telling of what SpongeBob was at the start. Just a simple show about simple characters trying their best to do things that made them happy. And that's what SpongeBob was trying to get Plankton to do. And it seems to be working at the moment. Plankton does go on to Team Good now for a little bit. As a matter of fact, Plankton's actions are a little vague in this episode. You don't really know what's going on in his head throughout most of it. He kind of likes SpongeBob for a while, but then there's this big twist where he was using SpongeBob for a patty. And I think that's why Mr. Krabs' skepticism about Plankton's change is 100% justified. Because you've got this scene with Plankton and Karen, and you honestly can't tell if Plankton's also playing Karen for a fool. Playing a supercomputer for a fool. A supercomputer from the 90s, let's be fair. But yeah, it does seem a little odd to have this scene. It's funny. It does add a little bit to show that Plankton is really starting to get used to SpongeBob's outlook on life, that everything can be fun. But at the same time, it is sort of confusing why he'd act that way to Karen, the person who gave him the plan. I guess to be safe. Oh, and Plankton's line there, Sponge Buddy, yoo-hoo, that was actually the inspiration for the name of the number one SpongeBob fan forum, fan site on the internet, Sponge Buddy Mania. You look in their history section on their website, and that is how it got its name, that line, Sponge Buddy. And it isn't as great as it used to be, but I think that still gets a lot of activity. I still go there occasionally. I go both there and the SpongeBob community, which is another fan site that a lot of people migrated to after a while. Won't say why, but there was a big migration last year. If you want to get an account on either of those fan sites, that's completely fine with me. I'm not forcing you. I'm just saying those are very popular places to talk about SpongeBob outside of YouTube comments and Encyclopedia SpongeBobia. So sorry for that little tangent on SpongeBob Mania, but that was just Mr. Krabs realizing that maybe Plankton isn't all that bad, and then maybe realizing that he isn't all that good either. And I suppose that this is our first time at the Reef, which is the name for the movie theater in Bikini Bottom. And one thing that I absolutely love about the Reef is its aesthetics, because this theater, this cinema in particular, does seem to have some tribal influence, and that's really fun. But something about this movie, I don't know if they put any thought into, like, making the movie something, because it's a sequel, it's about fishing, it's a romance movie. Maybe the music from the movie is playing in this dramatic scene as SpongeBob finds out that Plankton has stolen his patty. And Plankton does admit that he was still evil all along, somehow. But he was shown friendship, and he was shown how to have a good time with SpongeBob. SpongeBob's reactions are great. Plankton's speech is great without getting too sappy. It is an interesting way to take the episode. In the middle of a romance movie, it did sort of help/not help with the accusations a couple years after this. However, on the flip side, making it far more dramatic makes it far funnier when it is abruptly cut off, and far funnier in general. But indeed, this was a good Plankton plan that almost succeeded. That is, if SpongeBob didn't go back into adventure mode and just chased him through the theater screen. But it's revealed to be solid concrete, so it's not all that bad. But again, this is a nice little way to end the episode. I do enjoy it. And coming right up is the last time we see Bubble Bass for another 13 years. I forgot to mention he was in the scene earlier, crushing Plankton in his seat, but this is a much funnier use of his character. Doesn't appear again for another 13 years, but it's a nice maddening way to end the episode. And that was Culture Shock and Fun. Culture Shock I found to be alright. Nothing too groundbreaking, but it was very funny. It was a good episode. It did sort of further Squidward's character. And Fun, oh my gosh, it's just fun, you know? It is a very enjoyable Plankton episode where his scheme is genuinely... it does work. That's the thing about it. And SpongeBob is at some of his best here. You get a lot of different facets of his personality. The Mr. Krabs stuff is good. The Karen stuff is alright. It's just a great episode all around. And again, question of the week this week is, how do you watch SpongeComs? Let me know in the comments and it might be featured next week. Goodbye for now.